Well. What do we have here? The Nintendo Switch 2's best sellers list. Wait a minute. What is this? Number 2 and 3 are third-party games. So is 6, so is 9, looks like there's plenty of third-party games on the console that are doing well. Rhino, a super underrated game, Rune Factory, Hogwarts Legacy. Like, look at all of these third-party games that are in the bestsellers list on Nintendo Switch 2. Like, kind of amazing. Kind of like the idea that these games weren't doing well was a fabrication that like Zugi X and like the sales analysts like Twitter damage control team like have been pushing for them like to try and downplay the console. Like it's almost like that was completely made up. If only someone like me came out and like decried this nonsense to begin with. But like, oh wait a minute, that's exactly what I did. I was right. But anyway, um, that isn't the important bit here. The thing that interests me about this current situation is seeing like what is number two, because like the narrative going into this that like the community kneeled and acknowledged like Cyberpunk 2077 as like doing very very well, but like the narrative at the time was just like, well, that's because like Cyberpunk is like some huge cultural phenomenon, like the greatest game ever made. It was just some like cocksucking thing. Like Fantasy Life 2 is outselling Cyberpunk now. Fantasy Life 2 came out like a couple of weeks before Cyberpunk, on Nintendo Switch 1. And over the past like couple of weeks, because of recommendations from people like me and because of like the general gaming community, Fantasy Life 2 has really shot up the bestsellers list as being one of the most like the big notable third party releases on the platform. Because it's so well made, it's so engaging. There are lots of things I like about it because it's so appealing, fresh, exciting. Like Fantasy Life 2 excels because it was a new game from a franchise that Nintendo fans like that tried to sell itself on Nintendo Switch 2. Like as much as like people are like enthusiastic about Cyberpunk or Split Fiction or Street Fighter, like or whatever, Bravely Default, like a lot of these games are re-releases of like slop. Like that's kind of like my opinion when it comes to these games is that these are just ports from like older consoles. Like where was like the fresh, new, exciting like third-party content? They tried doing what they always do and tried like sabotaging Nintendo hardware by just releasing a bunch of like old ports on it to create the illusion that this console is like somehow behind. But here we are seeing a number of like new original third party games at crack the top 15. Rune Factory just came out recently as well. Fast Fusion, Fantasy Life. Like we we had a pretty solid like third party launch. Like there were like the shovelware slop, like Cyberpunk, but like by and large, this launch was a huge success. Not just because of Mario Kart World, which by the way, the narrative that this was the only game on the console was always completely false. Let's see. Yeah, we have the updates for the Zelda games, which are exclusive. We have yeah, Rune Factory, which was a day one game. We have Fast Fusion. We had plenty of options day one. Um, Hitman World of Assassination is fantastic. Um, like we had plenty of options day one. Like, but the narrative right from the get go was this idea that there was like nothing to play on this console, and that is just observably not true. Like, I really do think, like, a month later, well, almost a month later, we have like 4 more days to go. Like, almost a month later, like, we do need to come out and like speak out about this. Is just how insane this narrative actually was. Like, this idea that like this console had nothing to play on it. When like not only did you have brand new games with Mario Kart World, upcoming releases like Bonanza, like Kirby Air Riders, like things of that nature. Like not only did it have like all these third party games, like you had the entire back catalog of like Nintendo Switch games on on the eShop, right? You had backwards compatibility. So in that hypothetical scenario in which you put like 100 hours in the Mario Kart world, day one, month one, and then like had nothing else to play, like you could have just gone back and played older games that you missed. Like that's that's kind of my mentality on it. Like this console was not a fresh start. Like it's essentially a mid-gen refresh. People don't want to say that because they were really desperate for like Nintendo Switch to fade away and fail and stop succeeding. But like it is true that I do feel as if like the overwhelming like cultural narrative, like the zeitgeist of like pretending as if there's nothing to play on Nintendo Switch, on Nintendo consoles is just it's just completely collapsed. Like Tears of the Kingdom is a really good example of what I'm talking about here, because here was a game that was like aggressively hated and downplayed throughout like its entire initial
Upgrade
launch
your
period, right?
adventures in Hyrule on the
Like this was a game that like everybody tried to tell you was like a failure, that like it couldn't compete with other games, that it did poorly, in spite of selling like 21 million units in its first year or whatever. You know, the entire narrative is that this was overshadowed by other games. And what happens? Not only does this game get re-released on Switch 2 and like crack the top 5 twice, because of the upgrade pack being sold separately. Uh, you also have Breath of the Wild. The last game in the series, like also doing really well on the eShop. So like this is like a really good like a really good
Upgrade your
example of
adventures in
what I
Hyrule
mean
on the
when I
Nintendo
say it's
Switch
becoming
2.
like harder and harder to downplay Nintendo games, because like Breath of the Wild is a decade old and it's still cracking like bestseller lists. Like Mario Kart World is going to be like do similar numbers like long term, like probably even better than that. So like again, it's going to be very, 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 very difficult for anyone to come out and try and speak out about these games, like trying to downplay them and trying to say that like, well, I played that already. I don't like the game. There's nothing to play on the console, because like you are insane if you're genuinely trying to tell people that you've played all these games, because that simply isn't possible. Not only are there plenty of great games that aren't on the bestsellers list, like, but there are plenty of good games that did launch day one on the console. Mario Kart World, Fast Fusion, Rune Factory, Rido came out in the week since. Rido was really great, by the way. Like this is just an example, but like this is just one, like a look at 1 week on a Nintendo Switch 2, but this is a very telling situation. We're seeing a game that came out on Nintendo consoles that was like, actually marketed properly, that people knew was coming out, that people were looking forward to, that were hyped for, with Fantasy Life 2. We saw this thing do really, really well on the console, and like meanwhile, like other third party devs are like flailing around trying to pretend like, oh, we don't know how to succeed on Nintendo consoles. We don't make games for that demographic. We make mature games for mature gamers, and yet you realize that Cyberpunk is doing well too. So like, what are they going to tell people going forward? How are they going to cope? Like right now, it seems like their big thing is like, hyping up like, third party games on other platforms. I think Baldur's Gate 3 and Expedition 33 are two really good examples of that, of how they'll like try and say that like that's the audience they want and that's the kind of success they have. But in reality, like, Nintendo Switch 2 is dominating Expedition 33. Like Nintendo Switch 2 is dominating like, whatever shovelware like product, Lies of P, or like uh whatever else slop is coming out. Like Nintendo Switch 2 is like dominating that stuff without even trying. And the industry may not like acknowledge it, but like this is going to become more mainstream knowledge. Like people have spent like so much time trying to downplay the success of third party games on Nintendo Switch 2 that like, when the narrative completely collapses, and it will, um I really don't know what they're going to do going forward. I really don't, because they can't keep like crying about Nintendo the way they have and continue to get away with it. Like I do think more and more people are beginning to get sick and tired of being told that there's nothing to play on Nintendo consoles, when that like really observably is not the case. It's becoming more mainstream for people to kind of like agree with Harmon Smith takes on this regard, and it's because like everything I've been saying has been true. The gaming media, the gaming journalism industry is biased against Nintendo. PlayStation is out to drive them out of the industry. That's always been their business strategy. And like all the copes and seeds you have about the company, this misconception about them only being for children or third party games not doing well on the console, all of that is not true at all. And that is becoming more and more obvious all the time.